right. Hello, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about feminism and gender studies. So I asked you to read three essays for today. Helene Cixous's The Laugh of the Medusa, Judith Butler's Imitation and Gender Insubordination, and Chandra Mohanty's Women, Workers, and Capitalist Scripts. So we're looking at texts here that span the mid-1970s to the mid-2010s. Right, so first off, since gender studies really kind of begins with feminism, let's first have a quick look at feminism, how it's defined, and its history. All right, so feminism in literary criticism refers to a couple of different concepts, right? One is an examination of the role of gender in the composition, circulation, and reception of texts. It also refers to attempts to rediscover and promote texts and genres written and read by women that were previously ignored. So probably the best example of that form of feminist criticism would be a book by Gilbert and Gubar called The Mad Woman in the Attic, which talks about women as kind of submerged presences in Victorian literature, and also attempts to rediscover a number of women writers and texts from the 19th century. It's also a way of reading that highlights a text's relationship to the role of women in society. And the feminist and gender theorists that we're going to look at today are all involved in this enterprise in some fashion. Some will lean more heavily on one aspect of feminism than others. For example, Helene Cixous is going to be primarily concerned with the role of gender in the composition of texts. Chandra Mohanty is primarily concerned with that third definition of feminism there, that the relationship between women in society and the text. All right, so here is our very broad, very basic history of feminism. So in Western Europe and the Americas, feminism really kind of begins in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with what is often referred to as the first wave of feminists. And this first wave is concerned primarily with basic political rights, the right to vote, the right to own property, custodial rights over one's own children, things of that nature. The women's suffrage movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries would be an example of a first wave feminist movement. Now, the second wave, largely inspired by a book by a journalist named Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique, gets underway in the 1950s. And so the second wave is much more concerned with gender equality. So, the rights of women to work outside the home, the rights of women to manage their own business affairs, have their own credit cards, and also the right to bodily autonomy. A good example of a second wave feminist movement would be a group called NOW, the National Organization for Women. This generation of feminists is also often referred to as kind of like the pantsuit generation. This is women began dressing in ways that were more similar to the ways that men dressed. So, wearing pants, cutting their hair shorter. Often, things like in the 1980s, you see a lot of women wearing shoulder pads in jackets. So yeah, there are particular cultural expressions that come out of these movements as well, not just in literature or in film, but also even in things like fashion. The third wave takes over from the second wave in the 1990s. And it's much, the third wave feminists attempt to be inclusive in ways they felt previous generations of feminists were not. So third wavers try to include trans women in their activism, women of color, working class women, right? So they start to recognize um, the rights and contributions of women whom they felt previous feminist waves, which had been pretty white and middle class, had ignored. The third wave also focuses pretty heavily on sex positivity and also on feminine gender identity as a positive thing, right? So while the second wave mothers had cut their hair short and worn pantsuits, third wave feminists often dressed and presented themselves in ways that were kind of like distinctly feminine, but with a bit of a twist. So kind of like torn fishnet pantyhose, like brightly colored, often smeared lipstick, right? Smudged makeup, things of that nature. There's a kind of punk rock aesthetic that is often expressed in third wave feminism, sometimes actually called lipstick feminism. Um, that is exemplified by the Riot Girl movement. We have an example on the screen here of several Riot Girl zines, these kind of handmade publications that are just kind of cheaply produced on a photocopier. And another thing the third wave does is it attempts to reclaim derogatory terms like bitch and slut, terms that men typically use to degrade women. Kind of like trying to like reclaim those terms and using them in a positive way. Now, the existence of the fourth wave, when I first started teaching this class a long time ago, was largely arguable, but is now pretty much established fact. Um, the fourth wave is largely kind of continuous from the third wave, particularly in its embrace of diversity. It's what we call intersectionality, right? The idea that our identities are not made up of one particular thing, but kind of come from the ways in which all of our different identities, our class position, race, gender, sexuality, the way all of these things intersect with each other. The big distinction between the fourth wave and the third wave, as I see it, is that the fourth wave uses the internet as an organizing tool and a means of protest and expression. So while the third wavers were printing these handmade zines, the fourth wave is more likely to work kind of through social media and through memes and things of that nature. The Me Too movement would be an example of a fourth wave feminist movement. So, in terms of critical movements, there's a strong distinction between French feminism, which is more kind of descended from psychoanalytics and from structuralism, and Anglo-American feminist criticism, which tends to be more kind of political in orientation, more directly political anyway. So the text for French feminism is a book by Simone de Beauvoir, published in 1949, called The Second Sex. And in that book, de Beauvoir explores the relationship between biology, psychology, and the social position of women. And this biological focus is one of the things that kind of distinguishes French feminism from other forms of feminism. This focus on, the body in social practices. So de Beauvoir argues that society treats woman as the biological other of man. And we might want to think about this like this other, if we kind of go back to our Jacques Lacan lecture, the way Lacan is talking about the other as sort of the thing that can't be assimilated to the self, right? So in terms of Lacan's influence, um, French feminists also kind of take his idea of the symbolic order, right? That kind of that social structure that you're initiated into once you acquire language. Um, they note that in Lacan's theory, the subject kind of becomes mature, enters society by identifying with the father and separating from the mother. And so a lot of French feminism is kind of caught up in that idea of reclaiming the mother and the relationship with the mother. So the main linguistic foundation for French feminism is the idea that Western languages are indelibly male constituted, that is going to be generated by men, and male dominated, right? The structure and terminology of language tends to favor the masculine over the feminine. So this is referred to by Lacan and his feminist followers as phallogocentrism. So phallogocentrism literally means that discourse is organized around the phallus, that is the symbolic representation of a masculine presence, not a literal penis, as the prime signifier. And French feminists find evidence of phallogocentrism in vocabulary and syntax, the very way that sentences are structured in a linear fashion, the way feminine words are often regarded as the opposite or other of masculine words. Fixed classifications and oppositions tend to favor masculine identities. The rules of logic as applied to language are also referred to as a kind of masculine set of signifiers. The criteria for empirical evidence and objective knowledge, the very kind of idea of objectivity is regarded as kind of phallogocentric, right? That you can kind of separate yourself and your emotions from whatever it is you're talking about. And women's language, according to French feminists, is automatically appropriated by the phallogocentric discourse and incorporated into it, right? There's no way out of it. So if a lot of this sounds a little bit like Derrida, where he talks about these binary oppositions, where the first term in the pair tends to be the favored term. Yeah, this is all heavily influenced, not just by Lacan, but also by Derrida. All right, so the specific French feminist thinker we're going to talk about today is Hélène Cixous, who we see pictured here. And Cixous' connection to Lacan is a close one. She studied under Lacan. She was a student in one of his seminars. And the big idea that comes out of her work is something called écriture féminine, or women's writing. Right? Let's literally translate it from French. It means women's writing. You're probably going to see some similarities between this and the deconstructionist idea of, writing being either readerly or writerly, right? Lisible or scriptable. So Cixous' écriture féminine is rooted in Lacan's idea of the imaginary, right? That stage before the child's separation from the mother, and when you don't recognize yourself yet as a separate, independent being. And for Cixous, this form of writing rejects and indeed actively undermines logic, any form of fixed signification, and narrative closure, in favor of linguistic play. Again, remember, there's a big deconstructionist influence in French feminism. So the whole point of écriture féminine is simply to play with language, right? Not to tell a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Um, Subjective experience is thus valued over linguistic and or narrative coherence. And écriture féminine tends to be cyclical rather than linear, right? It's kind of circular. It goes back to goes back to the beginning, and encourages repetition, repeat reading, rather than simply ending at a point of closure. Um, there's an idea that's kind of similar to the American psychologist William James's notion of stream of consciousness. Écriture féminine transcribes for Cixous thought into language without consideration for or reference to any kind of ordering systems. So remember that a French feminist typically thinks of any kind of ordering system, whether it's a social hierarchy or a grammatical structure, as kind of inherently masculine. And so feminine writing sidesteps all of that for a kind of total nonlinearity, right? And to be clear, Cixous does not regard only writing by women as potentially écriture féminine. One of her prime examples, for example, is the Irish novelist James Joyce, particularly in novels like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, that reject conventional plot structures and frequently even conventional words and sentence structures in favor of experimentation with language. Finnegan's Wake, in particular, is notorious for its, well, like Cixous might read it as linguistic playfulness. Others might read it as inaccessibility. So Cixous also argues that writing is a bodily practice, right? That is, that the form writing takes, whether it's écriture masculine or écriture féminine, is related to the shape of the body. So masculine writing tends to be straight and pointed, like a phallus, while women's writing is cyclical and concave, like a womb. We'll give you an example of how this might be applied to a James Joyce short story when we start wrapping up at the end of this. So the end result of Anglo-American feminism by the 1990s is what we call gender studies. And this is actually more influenced by Foucault than by Derrida, particularly Foucault's archaeological investigations of human sexuality and the tenets of third wave feminism. And the big thing that gender studies does is question the validity of the male-female binary, in part by noting that across human societies, this is not a constant, right? That masculine and feminine identities are not identical across cultures, which suggests to the gender theorist that they are not biological in nature, but rather social. And indeed, some cultures recognize multiple possible gender identities. For example, in the way some Native American nations recognize what are called two-spirits individuals. That is, people who are either, male spirits born into female bodies, or female spirits born into male bodies, or non-binary spirits born into a male or a female body, right? So the basic point here is that because gender categories are not universal across human society, then gender is a social practice rather than a biological reality, right? Not taking a position on this, not trying to piss anybody off, This is how a gender theorist views things, right? So the big name in gender theory, gender studies, is Judith Butler, who comes up with the idea in the 90s of gender as performance, right? This is largely the result of her work. So she argues that gender is an artificial social construct with no biological basis, and uses the term gender to refer to a set of cultural norms and practices rather than to a person's biological sex, right? She regards that as something different from gender, right? Gender refers to cultural norms and social practices, right? It's cultural, not biological. She also argues that normative gender categories in any given society deprive individuals within that society of the right to form their own identities. So, gender performance for Butler is a place that is both a site of repression, where society encourages only particular kinds of gender performance, gender expression, but also a potential space of liberation and experimentation as people attempt to build their own identities in opposition to whatever the dominant paradigm is. Okay, so the last of the feminist and gender theorists we're going to talk about today is Chandra Talpade Mohanty. And she's less concerned with gender as performance than Butler was, or gender as biology, um, as was the case with Sisu, gender as kind of encoded in language. And she's much more concerned with, it's really a kind of, Mohanty's line of descent is really coming more out of Marxist thought. So she practices what she refers to as transnational anti-racist feminist theory. And what she provides is, in her work, is a critique of Western feminism from the perspective of a woman from a formerly colonized culture. So you might recall that term we talked about a few weeks ago, alterity, right? Alterity is the state of always being an other. She is looking at Western feminism from the position of alterity, right? From the position of the other. And in particular, she really kind of fights the Western notion, or the notion that she sees in a lot of Western feminist thought, that women from minority cultures, and particularly from the global South, are merely passive victims of men who need Westerners to save them, rather than individuals with agency within their own cultures. So a big part of her project is to try to connect feminist theory and praxis to resistance to global neoliberal capitalism. So she argues, for example, that free trade agreements primarily benefit consumers in wealthy countries while oppressing, in particular, poor women in the global South. And that race and gender categories determine which sorts of people do which sorts of work. So the essay that I had you read by Mohanty is primarily on wage labor for women in the global South. And so the big argument is that capitalist wage labor reinforces patriarchal hierarchies, traditional patriarchal hierarchies in nations in the global South. The discourse of development from groups like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, tends to assume that bringing free trade and capitalist manufacturing practices to these countries promises social progress for women that rarely ever ends up materializing. That's kind of her starting point for the argument. And the jobs that are offshored to the global south are typically low wage, low social prestige, and dangerous. So, for example, we've got women here doing garment work in a factory in Bangladesh for a lot less money than they would be paid in the U.S. Frankly, but through these offshoring relationships, multinational corporations create a dependency in these host countries on outside capital, right? They basically strangle um, developing industries in these countries in their cradles and make the country dependent on infusions of cash from wealthy corporations and wealthy nations. Um, she also argues that a lot of these jobs blur the distinction between work and home. Like a lot of these women uh, would be doing this kind of piecework, this kind of that we see them doing in the factory here in their homes in the past for their families and community. And now this home-based work is done in a factory under the watchful eyes of supervisors to be shipped off to who knows where. And that indeed, patriarchal practices like purdah, which in South Asia refers to the seclusion of women, basically women socializing and existing primarily in their own private spaces, is assimilated to the logic of production and profit by essentially allowing global corporations to open a factory like this one in which all the employees are women. And because all the employees are women, they are paid a lower wage than men doing the same work would be. Of course, men wouldn't be doing this kind of work in this particular society. Okay, so it's a lot of information to throw at you. Let's talk a little bit about how we might apply some of this to a text we've already discussed. So we've talked a little bit at various points about James Joyce's short story "The Dead," in part because it's one that I know very well and it's a personal favorite, and also because it is actually kind of a rich place for doing these kinds of readings. So one way we could look at "The Dead" is as a narrative that moves from the perspective of a working class woman, the caretaker's daughter Lily, who works as a maid for the Mrs. Morkan, to at the end of the story, a man's realization that his wife has an independent inner life. So moving circularly from woman's voice to woman's voice through a man's narrative intervention. So it has that kind of circular structure that Sisu prefers. And indeed, Gabriel himself, in his final monologue as he's watching the snow, or in his final interior monologue, sees himself kind of uniting, with the snow and with all of the, with all of the living and the dead of Ireland, right? So there is this kind of union with the Lacanian imaginary that occurs at the end. We might also think about this in terms of gender performance, particularly of the men, right? Gabriel's very patriarchal, presiding at the dinner table, doing all of the carving and serving the slices to everyone. The traditional masculine position at the head of the table, and also the fact that all of the academic and artistic men, right? Those who are not in or in professions that do not involve kind of like what we might think of as conventionally masculine work, are extremely insecure about their social position, and particularly in their interactions with women, right? We see this with Gabriel. We see this with the tenor Bartle Darcy. who angrily lashes out after someone praises his song. Can't can't you see I'm as hoarse as a crow? Um, so covering up his insecurity with a display of aggression. Another way we might think of this, and I think that the story is particularly rich with these examples, is the way it places women in the economic system, particularly in the capitalist economics of the British Empire around the turn of the 20th century. The we have several independent working women, for example, in the story, who do not present themselves as sexually available or as sex objects. Miss Ivers, we're deliberately told that she wears that her bodice is not low cut, or she did not wear a low cut bodice. Her dress is up to her neck, so not for display. The Mrs. Morkan themselves all make a living as musicians, right? Miss Ivers is a teacher. And we also see that the sons, Gabriel and his brother, were themselves kind of maneuvered into their positions in life by their mother. So middle class professional men kind of being made by their mother who doesn't have the same opportunities. Another way I like to think of this story is also the way the dowry system structures both the family life and the professional life of the Conroys and the Morkins, right? Only one sister in the family actually married, um, Gabriel's mother. The assumption then being that there was only enough dowry for one, which then forces the other two sisters to go out and work for a living, right? Aunt Julia is the leading soprano in one of the churches in Dublin, and Aunt Kate gives music lessons, right? Their daughter Mary Jane is a church organist. Or not their daughter, their niece Mary Jane is a church organist. Um, so they've managed to build a reasonably respectable middle class life. Um, but they do so perhaps in part through the exploitation of the caretaker's daughter, Lily, who's the first perspective we get. So this is just kind of an opening up of some of the possibilities of ways we can use different angles from feminist theory to read this text in terms of the way it deals with gender, and with gender performance and with gender and economics. So I really look forward to seeing what you might have to say about this text or about King Lear, arguably a arguably a misogynistic text, actually. Certainly some very interesting things going on with gender in King Lear, or any other text that you choose to try to apply some of this to. So we'll see you on the discussion boards, and we'll be talking next time about queer theory. So with that, I bid you adieu until next time.